Chesa will just call us to attention.
If everyone could have a seat. Thank you so much for coming, Erwin.
I want to thank everyone for being here, everyone in the audience, and especially the speakers. There's such a disconnect between the public's perception with regard to crime and the reality. Last Wednesday night, there was a debate in Los Angeles among 8 of the candidates for district attorney, and one would have sensed that crime was out of control in Los Angeles. One of the candidates referred to it as being like Gotham City, when in reality, there's been a dramatic decrease in crime in the last couple of years in Los Angeles. The same thing, of course, played out in the unfortunate recall of Chesa Boudin, where the reality with regard to crime in San Francisco was so different than the statistics. And so that's what makes this panel so important, is it talks about the influence of narrative on public perception of the crime and law. Because the perception itself is something that has to be dealt with. And how can we make the perception more fit with the reality? And so that's why I'm so grateful to you for being here. I'll let Chesa introduce the panel, but since I have the microphone, just for a moment, I want to take a chance to thank Chesa for the spectacular job he's done since being here, starting really just in June. The number of events that he's created for our students, the partnership that he's built locally and nationally is really wonderful. I think you know that Chesa is a graduate of Yale Law School, clerked on the Ninth Circuit, among other things, was a longtime public defender, was the elected district attorney of San Francisco County. And then when we created our Center on Criminal Justice and Society, we did a national search, and Chesa is the person that we all felt was the ideal person to head that center. And everything over the first few months certainly shows that. And so with enormous thanks to Chesa and to the panel, I know no one ever comes to a conference to hear the dean's welcome. I'll turn over the microphone.
Thank you so much, Erwin, and thank you for being here to join us and to welcome us and for creating the center. Erwin just flew in yesterday from arguing a case in front of the Second Circuit and has an unbelievably, impressively busy schedule. So I am super appreciative of his time today and of the energy and commitment he's put into creating this center and the trust in me to lead it. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Berkeley Journalism School, Mass Media at Berkeley Law, and the Berkeley Journal of Criminal Law. And thank all of you for coming today. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to just say a quick word about how this event came to be and kind of why we're here and my very high-level thinking, which may be different than some of what we hear from the speakers, and that's good too. Right when this center was started, I was having conversations with someone I've known for well over a decade and worked closely with during that time, Lara Bazelon, who's with us today. And she's so prolific and publishes so widely and diversely that I have to confess I hadn't actually read or even heard of her article in this book, Evidence of Things Seen. But she told me about the book, and she said, you know, maybe a book event on this would be a worthwhile event for your center. And indeed it is, and it will be. For me, as someone who had just lived through the recall that Erwin described, who has been the subject of lots and lots of media coverage, I have spent many years reflecting on the ways in which nonfiction writing about crime shapes public perception, the choices, ethical and strategic and literary, that writers and journalists make in telling stories, and the relationship between writing and media coverage of crime and public perception of crime. I don't pretend to have answers. I don't know that our speakers tonight, 2 of whom are writers and journalists exclusively, one of whom is a writer and journalist and also criminal defense attorney and law professor, necessarily have answers to those questions. But what I do know and what I can promise is the conversation we have over the next 2 hours, the reception afterwards with food, which I hope you'll all join us for, will be worthwhile, will be educational, and I, for one, am extremely excited to hear some of the thoughts, reflections, and lessons learned that our 3 speakers will share with us tonight. So with that, let me introduce them. I want to start with Sarah Weinman, who's immediately to my left and who's the editor of the book. And we do have some copies for folks to take with you. I don't know if we're going to run out, but okay, we're going to raffle them. So you've gotten tickets. We're going to raffle them. Thank you for coming. Once you win the raffle, you can get them signed by the speakers and by Sarah, who edited the book. Among many other things, Sarah writes the monthly crime and mystery column for the New York Times Book Review. She's also a 2020 National Magazine Award finalist for reporting and the Calderwood Journalism Fellow at McDowell. Her work has appeared most recently in The Atlantic, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, Washington Post, among many other publications that we've all heard of.
And a few we haven't.
And a few we haven't, sure. She's also published multiple award-winning books, and most recently is the editor of Evidence of Things Seen, the book that brings us together tonight. I don't know if it's won awards yet, but it surely will if it has not.
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so. To her left is Laura Bazelon. Laura is a law professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, where she directs the Criminal and Juvenile Justice and Racial Justice Clinics. She also holds the Barnett Chair in Trial Advocacy. Before her job at USF Law School, Laura worked as a deputy federal public defender in Los Angeles. She ran the Innocence Project in Los Angeles, and also, on top of being a fearless and successful courtroom advocate, has what some might consider a parallel career in writing, both fiction and nonfiction, award-winning work, and most recently, a phenomenal podcast that is a deep dive into a case in which she and her team successfully exonerated a man innocent of a murder that he was serving decades in prison for. And it was a podcast not done, as you might expect, after the fact, but rather done during the legal work she and her team were doing before they knew the outcome and while he was still incarcerated. It's really a masterful and very original and unique approach to combining her two careers. To her left is Justine Vanderloon, an independent journalist, an Emerson Fellow at the New America Foundation, and a reporting fellow at Type Media Center. Justine is writing a forthcoming book on women and mass incarceration. She's also working on a forthcoming narrative journalism podcast with Campside Media. She has numerous prior books, and her long-form journalism has also been published in all of the top news magazines that folks have heard of, and probably a few we haven't as well. She is the host, she's the lead reporter and co-producer of the investigative podcast Believe Her, and her journalism has won or been finalists for many awards, including the Silver Gavel Award. With that, I want to kind of kick the conversation off. I'm going to pass the mic in a moment to Sarah, but as the four of us were in dialogue ahead of this event about how we wanted to focus and how we wanted to draw on our different perspectives and backgrounds for this conversation, Laura communicated to the group in writing something that I think was extremely poignant, succinct, and well said. And I want to share that with you as a framework and as a list of questions that we'll all have in mind over the conversation ahead. Laura said, in essence, Evidence of Things Unseen is a play on Baldwin's classic Evidence of Things Not Seen, a 1985 book, about the unsolved murders of more than 24 children in Atlanta. And this is something that Sarah talks about in her introduction to the edited volume. As Laura goes on to explain, Baldwin was not interested in voyeurism or a straightforward, just the facts reporting, as much as he was interested in exposing fault lines, including racism and official incompetence, that enabled this reign of terror. No one really wanted to hear it, and Sarah's introductory essay goes a long way in explaining why. 40 years later, are we ready to hear that kind of true crime story? The story that isn't ripped from the headlines and ready-made for Netflix. The story with complicated victims, and here I think Justine has so much to say about criminalizing survivors, and complicated narrators, the way that Laura writes in her chapter about David Simon. How do you tell a true crime story with integrity? How can you embed yourself with one side without falling prey to explicit and implicit biases, something I hope we'll hear Laura talk about, particularly with regard to her recent podcast. How can you educate and, yes, compel through narrative without causing further harm, or I'll add, exploiting the subjects and sources of your reporting? Who gets to tell these stories and why? And are we willing to re-examine a power structure that puts people like Truman Capote and David Simon at the top? So with, I think, that really powerful introduction from Laura, let me pass the microphone, although you have your own, to Sarah and ask you to tell us a little bit about what led you to put this book together, and where'd you get the idea, and what did you hope to achieve, and who is your target audience?
Thanks so much, Chase. And that was quite an introduction for all of us as we ponder publications people have heard of and people haven't. Before I can talk about evidence of things seen as an anthology, I should preface this by saying this isn't the first anthology that I've edited. This is actually my fourth. And the first two were crime fiction. And I bring those up only to say that narrative, and particularly crime narratives, have played such a major role in my life, frankly, professionally, but also personally. It just feels like crime in general is the way that I look at society, at human behavior, at how people ought to function but so often do not, and how the extremities, particularly of behavior, can show us ways in which we process the mundane even. So crime fiction was my first conduit, but true crime was there kind of in tandem too. And it was roughly 9 years ago that the first season of Serial, the podcast about we now pretty well know it's the wrongful conviction of Adnan Syed in the murder of Hae Min Lee, his one-time girlfriend, in 1999. And that podcast, because it was told week by week, and people could sort of fall into this narrative as it was unfolding, it became very addictive, became very popular, but it also attracted an audience who might not have thought of themselves as consumers of true crime in the way that, say, I was, or other people that I knew, or other writers, or other fellow travelers in this field. But this brand new audience was coming to this particular podcast and, becoming addicted to it, being attracted to the podcast format. But then there was a third layer on top of all of this true crime consumption, which is true crime participation. So it wasn't enough that they were listening to Serial the podcast, they were also going on the internet, be it message boards, social media, whatever their choice, to find like-minded people, not just to discuss the ongoing outcome of this podcast, but also in some ways insert themselves into the narrative. It wasn't enough for them to listen. They had to, in some instances, reach out to key people who participated in the podcast and come to their own conclusions and assumptions. So all of these forces really fascinated me as someone who was already doing a lot of journalism in the crime space. And in fact, within a few weeks of the first season of Serial dropping, I had published a piece that became the basis for my first book, The Real Lolita, on the real-life case that inspired Vladimir Nabokov's pretty infamous novel. So I was thinking a lot about narrative and the like. And right around the time that The Real Lolita published in 2018 is when I had a conversation with my then editor at Echo, an imprint at HarperCollins. He thought it was interesting that there used to be these annual anthologies of essentially best American crime reporting. And would I be interested in doing something along those lines, since I'd had experience editing and putting together anthologies. And I wanted to do that, but I wanted to create an anthology that presented an argument. It wasn't just enough to have best American crime reporting. It had to say something about what was going on in contemporary, particularly American culture. And what I landed on with that anthology, which was called Unspeakable Acts and was published in the summer of 2020, was what did true crime look like in the aftermath of the massive popularity of that first season of Serial, and how did it change the game, not just for crime reporting in terms of journalism, but also different media? Like, how did it change now that people were listening to podcasts regularly, that there was this massive explosion of true crime documentaries, of scripted series based on crimes, of participatory elements. So I kind of wanted to get into all of that. And I structured that anthology in 3 parts. The first was what I thought of as traditional crime narratives that were, very intensively researched and reported investigatively, and really, I'll use it as a shorthand. The kind of pieces you would read in Texas Monthly in their heyday were pieces I was looking for that first section. The second section was meta-narratives of pieces about true crime that were critiquing the genre, that had interesting things to say about it. But it was the third section that I really wanted to widen the lens and look at the bigger picture and ask the question, what do we even think of when we think of crime narratives? What constitutes a crime narrative? Can a piece about the history of Customs and Border Patrol, can that count as a true crime story? Why is it that this genre is so essentially by white people, about white people? And what does that tell us about what's missing and who is overlooked and whose stories are not being told? So I got into some of that, but I knew that I wasn't done with putting together anthologies as arguments. And two things really, I think, crystallized what I intended and hoped to do with what became Evidence of Things Seen. And I get into it in the introduction, which I will not fully spoil because I hope you will read it. But reading Baldwin's last published book, which was The Evidence of Things Not Seen, that line, by the way, is a line from the New Testament. And that book is essentially a book-length essay based on his original reporting for Playboy in the late 70s, early 80s, when he was asked by his editor, probably the only black editor at the publication, to go to Atlanta and figure out what was going on with these child murders. And of course, what Baldwin did was not a traditional true crime narrative at all. What he did was go there and sort of take the temperature of why people were full of rage and why they were not getting the answers they needed, the systemic failures of the government. But he also did something which I still think about, that he witnesses the parents of the murdered children, but feels like he can't go up to them and ask them to transmit their trauma and pain to him, that it would be too much. He would be an interloper. He would be, exploitative. And so the book that results from it really baffled people at the time. They just didn't know what to make of it. It didn't fit the contours of what a crimes nonfiction book was supposed to be then. But now I think it makes much more sense as we are in this continuing, ongoing, and exacerbated, unsettled times where all narratives seem to be shifting beneath our feet, where disinformation is rampant, where we just, can't make head or tail of what the truth is. And Baldwin came in and just was Baldwin. So that, in conjunction with the artist Faith Ringgold, who had an exhibition of her work in early 2022, and she had two pieces about the Atlanta child murders. And at the New Museum, where I saw them in New York City, they were in this little alcove, set off. It was almost blink and you missed it, and I almost did. And then I just stopped, because it was like, here was a woman, a figurative woman in a torn dress, and she's clearly representing the parents of murdered children. And then there's a chess piece where chessboard where each piece is representing one of the children. And I just stood there and took it all in and thought, this is communicating so much more artistically and narratively than so much of what constitutes, quote, true crime. And I thought, these are the ways in, but these are the ways in which we wouldn't have thought were the way in. So ultimately, those were my guiding forces in terms of the pieces that I was looking to curate and include. And that leads me to what Lara and Justine, I hope, will talk about in terms of how their respective pieces came into being and what questions they were asking of those pieces, and essentially the questions they still need to ask.
Let's continue from right to left and go to Lara. And I want to just preface what Lara's going to tell us about her article and the work by saying that it is a takedown of somebody who, until I read her article, had a lot of respect lot of respect for. Many of us will have seen and enjoyed, as I did, David Simon's The Wire, and perhaps even his subsequent show about Baltimore police called We Own This City. I would have thought, having watched the first series at least twice all the way through, and this is someone, I don't actually own a TV, I've never owned a TV, so the fact that I've watched The Wire twice all the way through is really saying something. One of the things that I liked about it, and that I think made it such a successful piece, was the complexity and nuance of the characters, of all the characters on all sides of the cases and the stories he told. And yet it turns out that so much of his work, we learned from reading Laura's story, was misleading and dishonest. I'll leave it at that and let Laura tell us more about what she learned, how she learned it, why she chose to write the story.
Thank you. I didn't start out, and I really didn't want, and this was a back and forth kind of heated conversation that was happening between me and my editor at New York Magazine, for it to be a hit piece about David Simon. Like Chesa, The Wire, I think that's one of the best shows ever made. It was a huge part of my life. I remember when I was newly married watching it. I remember when I was pregnant watching it. We would watch the episodes when they dropped in real time, and I was completely riveted. And I actually think it's one of the rare shows that gets better. I think the fourth and the fifth seasons are incredible, especially the one about the kids. And yet, I had been in touch with an attorney in Baltimore who was representing 3 individuals who had been wrongfully convicted in the early 1990s, and they're called the Harlem Park 3. And he told me that the detectives who were the forces behind that wrongful conviction were people that David Simon had embedded with and, spent a great deal of time with. I think there's been reference to that kind of embedded reporting in journalism in his groundbreaking book, which is called Homicide. I think Life on the Murder Streets or Life on the Streets. Life on the Street. And he spent a year in 1989 with the Baltimore Homicide Department. And I combed that book. I don't know that I've ever read a book that carefully, and it's incredibly alarming. It's one of those things that at the time it won awards, it was heralded, it's sold, I think, really well, and it established his career. It was the basis for the show Homicide. It was the basis for the character John Munch, who some people might know from Law & Order SVU. It really established him. And when you read it now, it's really disturbing. And part of the reason that it's so disturbing is that he's documenting these tactics by the police in getting people to confess, in getting these convictions that in the late 1980s and early 1990s were fairly typical, I think, for major police departments who will tell you that there were multiple murders happening a week, that they were overwhelmed, that they were trying desperately to find out who actually did it, but they weren't really trying to do that. And part of the reason was because they didn't exactly see the population that they were dealing with as human. And the way that it's told in the book, I just want to read you a couple of things from it and before I get to the Harlem Part 3 of it all. There's a scene where 2 of the detectives who became the major characters or the basis for 2 of the major police detectives in The Wire, who were absolutely inspired by them, and one was even named after them. They are trying to investigate a murder. They're trying to get this witness to talk to them. She's a juvenile, and she's wearing this yellow miniskirt. And one detective looks at her and says, "Thinks, hell of a body." And then when she won't cooperate with him, he screams, and this is in all caps, "You are a lying bitch." And then when she still won't cooperate, he says, "You just got a charge, you lying piece of shit." Then he leaves her alone. This is a teenager in a cramped interrogation room. He calls out to his partner, "Neutron this bitch," which is apparently a request for them to swab her hands for gun residue. But they want her to think that someone's about to irradiate her. And David Simon describes this as one example of Jay Landsman, this detective, who is Jay Landsman in The Wire, of his blitzkrieg, which often succeeded simply because of its speed. So that was the kind of thing that these folks were doing on a regular basis. And then I started digging around through the Baltimore Homicide Department exonerations in this database, and there's 25 of them. And a lot of them are the result of this collection of people that David Simon was embedded with in 1989 and went on to glamorize and stayed friends with and wrote about glowingly in the new edition of Homicide, Life on the Streets. And they did this stuff all the time, a lot of times to kids, and they wrongfully convicted them. And that's what happened in the Harlem Park 3. They got a kid alone, they shook him down, they got him to name these 3 other kids in this murder of a teenager that had happened at a school. And these kids, they were tried as adults. I think they were 15 or 16, and they got life without parole. And this one does actually appear in Homicide. It's the only wrongful conviction that does, but it does. Midway through the book, there's this dramatic confrontation between one of the boys who's been wrongfully convicted and the detective who did it. And basically, there's been a riot at this prison where they put this kid in an adult prison, and they've been called down to investigate it, and they drag him in as potentially a witness to what had happened, and the detective starts asking him questions. And I just want to back up and say, this is someone who at this point was 19, so he's still a teenager, and David Simon describes him as a thick-framed 19-year-old monster. That's what he says about him. So in this dialogue, Mr. Watkins, the wrongfully convicted 19-year-old, has something to say, and it's not about the riot. Staring down the detective, he said, "How the hell do you sleep at night?" And the detective says, "I sleep pretty good. How do you sleep?" And he says, "How do you think I sleep? How do I sleep when you put me in here for something I didn't do?" Then he starts crying and says, "You lied, and you're lying now." The detective tells him he's guilty. He tries to argue. The other detective who wrongfully convicted him cuts him off, tells the guards to take him away, and says, "We're done with this asshole." They collectively did 108 years before they were exonerated, and they recently got a $48 million judgment, which sounds large, except then you have to remember that it's split 3 ways and that the lawyers got a big chunk of it. So in the process of doing all of this digging, and not just the folks that I've talked about, but other characters appearing in this book and then appearing on this list, and then all the people not in the book who appeared on this list, and sort of what happened to their stories, right? I mean, we got to hear about these detectives and how they speak for the victims, they speak for the dead, they do everything in their power to get justice. That's really what this book is about. They're hard driving, they curse, they scream, but it's all, we're told by David Simon, in the pursuit of this larger objective, which is to get justice for the victims and to make the streets of Baltimore more safe. And actually, that's all pretty fraudulent. And in the process of realizing that and writing this piece, it was hard to think about David Simon, someone who I admire deeply as just an incredible writer, in the same way, and quite frankly, corresponding with him while writing it also was an interesting experience, because there was certainly not a lot of reflection and insight, and there was a great deal of who the fuck are you and how dare you in some of the back and forth. So
Sounds like David.
So I say all of this because I think it is really, really important to examine kind of so-called classics. And I know there's a lot of discussion about, it's unfair to read Huckleberry Finn through the lens of 2023. It's unfair to, think about Gone with the Wind through that. But it really isn't unfair. I mean, things are works of art and they exist in a certain period of time and they tell a certain kind of story. And also it is important to, I think, re-examine them through the lens of how we've hopefully evolved as a society and the kinds of things that we've learned. And I guess before turning the mic over to Justine, because I think I've talked long enough, I will say that what was really interesting about digging into this, and because I'm a lawyer, I was really, really interested in all of the pleadings and the cases, and especially in the civil lawsuits that followed, even though my editor was like, "That's super boring, don't talk about it." But what was really interesting about that was that sort of around the same time, my colleague who's here, Charlie Nelson Keever, and I were investigating the case that we then turned into a podcast with help from Campside Media. Justine and I are linked in that way as well. And lo and behold, the Indianapolis Police Department was doing the same thing. I mean, when you go to all of these police departments, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago, Indianapolis, LA, they're all doing the same thing, where They are coercing people. They're screaming at them, especially kids, trying to get them to break. They are also burying evidence and in a weird way creating their own kind of novel. It's almost like they had a rough draft and the story didn't make a whole lot of sense because there were multiple suspects and evidence that didn't match. So they just leave all of that in the file and turn over the nice cleaned up version to the editor, i.e. the prosecutor, and that's the case that the jury is told about. And so it was interesting to kind of examine it forensically in Baltimore and then see it sort of in real time as we were finally able to get the documents in our own client's case. So it was kind of interesting to write about it and then live through it with a different police department, but kind of similarly situated.
Before I invite Justine to tell us about her article, I want to preface it by just saying that when I read this book, one of the articles that really stood out the most was Justine's. And she'll tell you about it in much more detail, but it's an article at a high level that looks at this question of why women go to prison. And my own mother spent 22 years in prison. My father spent 40 years in prison. And I got to know a lot of the people in their prisons over the course of my life. And as much as I learned many lessons from those prison visits, one of the things that stood out in starkest contrast was the reality that almost every single woman in my mother's prison had themselves been a victim of domestic violence, of sexual assault, of human trafficking, of other unthinkable lived experiences. And I don't say that to justify, in all cases, the things that they did or to even necessarily explain them. But it's a reality that is simply inescapable when you look at who we send to prison. And I think Justine in her work, and I hope we'll learn about her ongoing work in this space, does a much more rigorous and deep dive into that question than anything I've come across in all of my decades of following this issue and thinking about it myself. So thank you for the work, and please tell us more about it and what's next for you as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's interesting because it turns out that Lara and I, even though we published these articles in different publications, we actually had the same editor, I think, right? Ethan Brown was our editor for both of it, and then we are working with the same podcast company. But also, your mom was in Bedford Hills. So sort of interestingly, my article, it's about criminalized survival, which just a quick definition, a really broad definition would be people, mostly women, who have taken actions to protect themselves against physical or sexual violence and have been prosecuted and incarcerated for those actions. And that's a really basic way of explaining it, but it's got a lot more nuance to it. But it kind of started in a way in Bedford Hills, even though the main piece here concerns a woman named Tanisha Williams, who is currently incarcerated in Michigan. In late 2018, so there's a report called the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline done by an organization called Human Rights for Girls or Rights for Girls. And that looked at how girls, primarily black girls, brown girls, who are in the juvenile justice system, have histories of serious sexual abuse, rape, physical abuse, almost like all of them. And I was really taken by that idea of these children being, in a way, punished for what they'd gone through. So I thought about reporting on that, but reporting on kids is a whole different area of consent and figuring out who's who. So I started looking into how it might happen for women, and I became interested in a case, and I don't know if people have heard of it, but it's the Nicole Adamando case in New York State, which was kind of well known. There was like a 2020 and I think a Dateline, and I started following that case. Nikki Adamando was at the time 28 years old. She had a documented history of severe domestic abuse, sexual violence from her partner, who was basically kind of allegedly, potentially, sex trafficking her on Pornhub, and she had an enormous amount of documentation because she had been trying to leave. And according to Nikki, they had an altercation that was kicked off by the fact that she really was trying to leave. As we know, women try something like 7 times on average to leave before they successfully do. So this was an altercation. He pulled out a gun, and in the end, he was killed. And I was puzzled by the case, and I remember even pitching it to an editor, and the editor said, well, like, but they're prosecuting her, so and it's a really well-known prosecutor, like really well-respected, so like, there must be a case, you know, and nobody knew what was happening. It's in Poughkeepsie, New York. So I ended up becoming obsessed with this case. I did a podcast, it's called Believe Her, all about the case, and I went up and I followed the trial, and I went to every day of the trial, almost every day, which took, I want to say, 3 weeks or something, and I watched it all, and then I kind of talked to everybody, and I got all this discovery in it, and I was like, yeah, but they can't find her, like, guilty. I mean, because she also has all the evidence and the pictures of her face and the pictures of her screenshots on Pornhub. Guilty. 19 years to life. And as a journalist, I mean, unlike lawyers, I wasn't used to seeing everything like unfold in real time. It was so bizarre to me to see this happen and then to like have my perspective, but to see this like judge and these lawyers and the prosecutor coming up and saying, you know, like, but it was kind of like a kink game, right? Like you were kind of into it though, maybe, or like you're kind of like, you know, just seeing these really old tropes used in 2000, I think it was 2018, 2019, which led me to my larger question, which is like, does this happen all the time? You know, and so I called these, all the attorneys in this space, all the attorneys in this space were like, yeah, all the time. All prisons are full of them. And I was like, okay, so what's the data so that I can report on that? And they were like, no data. So what is interesting in terms of even storytelling there is the reason that there was no data is obviously because, well, it seemed to become clear to me was because what the truth is what the trial says it is. So if you're guilty, now you're in prison. There's no like, oh, she said this happened and we think maybe it did, but she's a little innocent, but like, no, it's just guilty. She's guilty of murder. That's all it says. That's the only thing we have on record, and that's the only truth there is now. What she said, we proved it was wrong. A jury decided it was wrong. That's the only data we had. So then I was talking to an amazing attorney in Chicago, whose name is Rachel White Domain or Rachel Domain White?
I think it's White Domain.
White Domain, double-barreled name and I was saying to her how, because she has a project where she only does like post-conviction work for survivors of violence who are in prison for that reason. And I was like, how can we ever know? How can we ever know? Like, there's no way to know. And she was like, why don't you just ask them? And I was like, just ask the people in prison? She said, yeah, why don't you just write to them? Just write to them. And somehow I had thought, well, there's no way to contact them. That's that. But she was like, just write them a letter and ask. So I basically started a survey, and I wrote to 10,000 people, which seemed at the time that I started it to be a reasonable endeavor, and became clear was not, because I didn't even know how much stamps cost, which it turns out are not 29 cents, which is what the last time I had bought stamps. And were in fact 55 cents each, which I can't really do math much, but that was a lot more than I had, and also all of the various costs, and I thought it would be really nice to write like, dear so-and-so. Right, I also was like, I don't want to just write in a form letter. I designed this kind of survey with this person, and I was like, I want to write like dear to the person and sign my name, which on the first letter seemed like a good idea. On the 5,000, but you gotta be consistent with data. It's all got to be the same. So anyways, I got 1,000 responses, which is what my book is about. And this article was kind of the beginning of that project. And I profiled a woman named Tanisha Williams, who is in Michigan. She's a Black woman who came from a history of severe sexual violence, like basically just abuse, just surviving her whole life. I said to her, can you describe to me, like, what was it like at those years? She's like, what? She's just like survival. That was all it was. And she had a gun to her head. Somebody committed a murder. She was there. She was there because she was homeless, and he had given her a place to stay, and she didn't want to go sleep in a car, so she stayed even though he was abusing her. He killed somebody, had a gun to her head. She didn't tell. The guy who died was like an innocent guy. She didn't tell, and 6 years later, about 6 years later, when she'd gotten her life together, she had been terribly haunted by what she'd been involved in. It was a cold case. And She thought, I'm going to tell. I'm going to get right. I found my way in life. I'm going to do the right thing. She said, this is America. I'm going to follow the rules for once. And the truth's going to set me free, and it's going to help his family. So she did, and now she is serving 20 to 40 in Women's Huron Valley Prison. She took a plea because she had an attorney who was paid $1,000 cap to do her homicide trial, which has been described to me as essentially getting paid peanuts for like brain surgery. So that is, so Tanisha is one of my characters, but she is just one of, I'm gonna guess, thousands of people in prison and in women's prisons for this sort of thing. It's really nuanced, but when we started talking about this event, I realized I had read a lot of the pieces in the book, but I actually hadn't read the whole book as one. And I read it, and I think what's really interesting about it is that it does shift perspectives. I think that's a lot what Sarah was trying to do. All these different pieces take the narratives that we have been given and give them back to people who haven't typically gotten to say their piece, and sort of with the help of journalists, because I think what journalists can do is provide that background. Whereas like if Tanisha's sitting in prison and saying to you like, this happened, everyone's like, okay, sure. But if you can come with the documentation and provide that, you can help really shift the story in a way that's evidence-based, which I think attorneys really can help do as well. And that's my ongoing work, so.
Thank you. One of the questions that I want to follow up on, I have a lot of questions for all of you, but I want to think about this issue of nuance, and it's something that came up in all of your writing and all of your comments just now. So often, particularly in public safety dialogue and media coverage, we're dealing with a two-dimensional kind of black and white world, right? There's the good guys and the bad guys, and we know the racist tropes that go along with that. We know how easy and comfortable it is to tell a story about somebody who is a criminal, who does bad things, and somebody who's a victim who does good things. And obviously, that's not the way the world works. And we learn that, I think, probably most intensely from your work, Justine, but it's right there, everywhere you look in Laura's work and throughout this book. I found that everywhere I looked in my career as a public defender, as a prosecutor. And yet, as journalists, as people who are writing and communicating to the public, so often your job is to figure out ways to connect with your reader, to get them to click on your story, to subscribe to the magazine where you publish, to read the whole thing. And we as a culture, we as a country have bought into these black and white narratives very deeply, very profoundly. It's part of our culture. I know that all of you have, in some ways, the luxury, though maybe a curse as well, of writing long form. You're not just doing quick hit, breaking news, 200-word stories. And yet, some of the pressures and temptations must be there. How do you think, in your own writing, in your own research, and your own choice of story, about ways to break free from the pressure to tell stories in that mold and actually get at the complexity and nuance of the subjects, of the characters, of the facts? Maybe start with you, Sarah, and go down.
I mean, I think that the story choices that I've made throughout my career try to kind of go against, I don't know, whatever typical true crime storytelling tropes there are. It's interesting that while both Laura and Justine were talking, especially with respect to, wrongful convictions and criminalized survival and the like, that, the story of mine that came to mind wasn't even one of my books. It was actually the one that was a National Magazine finalist, which was on the women who had been assaulted and raped and in one instance murdered by the man who was actually responsible for being the perpetrator of the Central Park jogger case. And that is a case in which all of the things that, Laura, you talk about in terms of reading homicide with this, new perspective and seeing all of the glaring, alarming faults of it, and the fact that essentially this kind of policing rhymes in state after state after state, that there may be differences in individual cases, but it seems as if police also follow particular tropes of how they do interrogations and all the ways in which they just do horrible things that can lead to exonerations, and in worse cases, not exonerations. That so many people are still stuck who we don't even know. And while I was doing this piece on what I think of as the larger Central Park narrative, it just felt like, again, I was peering through the cracks of how is it that how did we get this story so wrong? How is it that there were so many people let down, so many victims of this case? It wasn't just the original 5. One of the myths about it is it wasn't 5. There were maybe even 7 or 8. There definitely was 6. There was a 6th young man, Stephen Lopez, who finally got his conviction fully vacated after years of being ignored and not thought of. And then there were these women who were the actual victims of the perpetrator who, if they had caught him at the time, would never have suffered, irreparable harm to their lives. But because of police officers who in many cases were working the same cases, they weren't communicating. They were stuck in a narrative. They were stuck in crime rates being so high in New York at the time, and this desperate need to clear cases and to follow particular patterns that we now know are just completely off base and caused so much damage. So that was an instance where just looking at the story again and trying to reframe it, but still feeling like there are still parts of that story that I think still need to be fully told. So that's sort of a long-winded but elliptical answer to your question, but that's what I was thinking about in terms of just the ways in which narrative can be just used for ill.
The story that your question made me think about, Chesa, is a piece that I wrote for The Atlantic about California's revision to the felony murder rule, which was spearheaded by Chesa and my really close friend, Kate Chatfield, who was the number 2 in the district attorney's office when Chesa was there and is just an incredible strategist and thinker. But basically, the legislation made felony murder much harder to obtain as a conviction. So before the legislation, all you had to show was that the person who was involved in the criminal act was intended to do what they call a predicate felony, sort of a less serious felony, often a burglary or a robbery. And then if it went horribly wrong and someone died, they were just as liable as the person who did the killing, even if they lacked the intent. There was no need to show any kind of criminal intent. You could jump right over that straight to guilt, and they would be convicted in California as first-degree murderers. And there was actually, Justine, when you were telling about your study, I was thinking about Kate because they collaborated with Colby Lentz and with all of these projects that support women prisoners, and they pushed all of these surveys into women's prisons to see how many women in prison who were doing life or effective life terms had gone down on felony murder as what I call the tertiary character, not the killer, but the person who was driving the car, the person who was a lookout, the person who was maybe like the but-for cause way up the chain. The lure. And lo and behold, it's a disproportionate number of the people who in women's prisons are doing very, very long sentences. And consistent with Justine's findings, they were almost all of them pretty much victims of horrific abuse. They were often in abusive relationships with a romantic partner who had coerced or induced them to do the initial thing, and then the partner went on to commit the murder, or they were a brother or a sister or a parent, and they were in some kind of intimate entanglement with the person who actually did the shooting. And in some cases, they ended up getting even more time. And so when I started reporting this, because I was close to Kate, because I'd been following the legislation, I kind of thought, I understand what I'm writing about, and I sort of understand what my, quote, agenda is, which is to explain why people like the first woman, Anissa Jordan, didn't deserve 28 years to life. You know, she crossed the bridge with her boyfriend. They were gonna maybe rob some people. Her job was to like lure these, she was a lure. She was supposed to flirt with these men and then walk away. And then her boyfriend came up and was supposed to rob them. But of course he ended up killing somebody. And to me, like, Anissa getting a sentence like that when, you know, the worst thing she'd ever done was maybe a series of thefts, and she had a drug addiction, and this guy was very abusive, and she had these 4 children. It just seemed so extreme to me that she was doing that amount of time for her role. I mean, she was blocks away when it happened. She had gone back and was sitting in the car. And it ended up being a little bit more complicated for me. And we've talked about sort of race and class. And I guess I wanted to, even though this feels really risky, make it kind of personal. And I will spill some tea about The Atlantic, which is if you're a freelancer at The Atlantic, your piece is coming out like 9 years after you pitched it. So, you know, I pitched it to my editor, and I before the revision passed, it passed, and then I think 2 more years went by before they decided to run it. If it's not a breaking story and you're sort of a nobody, The Atlantic is like, we'll get to you when we get to you, which is a whole other conversation that we can have, you know, at the reception, because I have an analogy that I don't want to repeat here because it's not proper. But in any event, during all of this time, I started doing more reporting, and I found not just Anissa, but this other case that was a case in which this was Anissa was in her 30s. This other woman named Nicole I think she was 17. I think she's half Chinese, half Japanese. She had a very like turbulent, pretty low income life, and she had ended up living in Sacramento, and she had this boyfriend named Matthew, and it was like Romeo and Juliet. They were just completely in love. I think they met when they were 13 and 14, and they just completely fell in love with each other. And he was the one stable person in her life. Her parents were a mess, divorced. There was a blended family that was not blended in a good way. There was all kinds of chaos, but Matthew was kind of this mainstay. And he was also his mother, Stephanie's only child, and her whole life. And through a variety of circumstances, you know, there was jealousy, there was drama, teenage drama, basically, as I now know, having teenagers myself. And they come up with this plan that she's going to get this guy and his friends to this guy wanted to date her. This guy, John, was like, I want to be with you. And then somehow they come up with a scheme where he and his friends are going to beat up Matthew, and she just has to get him to this park where they would always meet in secret because their parents didn't approve of their relationship. So and Stephanie didn't approve of it, and they always met on the sly in the park. And so she brings him to the park, and instead of beating him up, John and his friends murder him. And this one was so much harder for me because I spent like 6 hours with Stephanie, and this happened in 2005, and it might as well have happened yesterday. I mean, every single moment of this, from like her begging him to stay home, it was Christmas Eve, it was raining, she begged him not to go, he insisted on going anyway. He said he was going to walk if she didn't give him her car. She made him promise to come back by the time the fudge that she was baking was ready. And then when he didn't come back, she had this like horrible sinking feeling, and then driving around all night and finally finding him. And then just the rage and the pain that she felt. And as I'm sitting there, all I can think about is like my own beautiful son and being a single parent, and like, oh my God, what if my son's worst mistake was that he fell in love with the wrong person? And like, I could see my son going to a park, and I could just sort of see the whole thing instantly. Like I related to her in a way that I didn't relate to the murder victim's mother in the Anissa Jordan case, because that was a totally different case. It was in the Tenderloin. Like kind of everyone there was up to no good. It turns out that guy had a felony record. Everyone was older, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so as I went home to try to write this part of it, I just completely broke down. And after 3 years, I called my editor and started crying and said, I actually can't write this anymore because I don't even know what I think about the felony murder rule at this point. She has a petition to get out, and she got the same sentence as Anissa. And when I read the prosecutor's closing argument, and she says, there's Nicole in the center of the pyramid, there is Nicole, there would be no murder but for Nicole. Make no mistake, she may be 16, but she is the but for cause. She is the reason we are here today. And I'm reading the transcript and I'm looking at the mom. All I can think is oh my God, I understand why she feels this way. But of course I could understand that because she kind of looked like me, and we had sort of a similar life. I could picture that happening to me, to my kids. And it was disturbing to me that it completely reframed how I thought about it because of race, because of class, because of proximity, because it was so much more immediate and it was so much more possible. And, I ended up writing it anyway. But but it really changed my thinking. And I say that because I feel like with long form pieces that take a long time, either because we have to dig or because, we're on the back of somebody's long list of things to get to, oftentimes the deeper you go, the more complicated it is. And you start out thinking one thing and then you think another thing. And I feel like that's what happened with Charlie and me when we were reinvestigating our client's case. Because I think we went in feeling like pretty binary. Like our client was Black, wrong place, wrong time, totally innocent, railroaded. It was a white victim. They treated him differently for that reason. I don't want to speak for Charlie, but like I tried to put the victim's family somewhat out of my mind while we were reinvestigating. I tried not to really think about it because I don't know, because I was like, well, that's not my job. My job is to get Leon out. But actually in the course of reinvestigating it, we spent a ton of time with the murder victim's sister, and it's a really complicated story. It's an LGBTQ story. He was a closeted gay man in the 90s. He had gone to this neighborhood probably to pick someone up. It had gone horribly wrong, and he had been executed, essentially. And like, the more time we spent with the sister and the pain of that family, the more just like three-dimensional it was. And then even more weirdly, the detective who was kind of behind the whole wrongful conviction, we spent so much time with him that it was hard to really like see him as a villain anymore. And by the end of it, not just investigating the case, but then afterwards, I think Charlie and I doing the podcast and going back over all the tape and talking to people all over again, it was like, it was the opposite of a binary experience. And I had gone into it, I think, as a trial attorney thinking in a really binary way, and even maybe like thinking about the podcast in that way. And my favorite part of the podcast is this organic thing that happened, which is that the crime victim's sister, his surviving sister, is really close with our client, and they've like met, and it's a really beautiful part of the podcast that we didn't engineer at all, that they did on their own. And I guess all of this to say that like reporting on these things is so complicated. Everyone involved is just a very layered, textured person. And I think maybe some of the critique of kind of prior crime coverage and narratives and the danger of embedding oneself is that you're so blinded by your proximity to one side and your either lack of access or inability to access what's going on the other side, that the story is slanted and it leaves too much out. And so I think that's kind of one of the takeaways for me. And when I say leave things out, I mean it kind of in every way, whether you're leaving out the story of the victim or you're leaving out the story of the person who's been convicted, or you're leaving out or you're not fully paying attention to your own thesis, which is, well, this legal change is good, and now I'm going to show you why, when it's actually very complicated.
Remind me what the question was. Yeah, really. I mean, I got so into everyone's answer that now I'm like, long form.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to repeat the whole question,
Yeah.
but it was
I'll
to
remember.
talk about the complexity and nuance of writing stories about three-dimensional characters and three-dimensional issues in a space where the tropes and the consumers are often looking for and expecting two-dimensional black and white narratives.
Yeah. So, I mean, but like, are they looking for that, or are they just being given that? I guess is a question that I ask myself. Sort of, I like Crime Junkie. I know, like I like listen to what are their names? Ashley and Britt. And I listen to Dateline telling me about like down the rushing rivers, the body of whatever. Like I listen to these and I enjoy them almost as, if I ever meet Ashley and Britt, I don't want them to hear that I said anything, but it's like junk food. Like you don't come out with, but it's yummy. And then you leave, and I think about them a lot, and I consume them a lot because it's sort of relaxing in a weird way, which I haven't fully understood why that is relaxing.
I assume you've seen that SNL skit.
Is there one about Ashley and Britt?
No, but it's the one about like murder show and watching true crime documentaries to relax.
To relax.
It's
I haven't seen the
hilarious.
Skit.
I haven't
need
seen
to
it.
see the skit.
And
I should see the skit.
right, yes, you should.
Apparently, we all should.
Yeah.
Well, so I understand why fictional crime is relaxing because there's a solution. Like every SVU, you get the killer. He's arrested, and that works. So I do listen to those to relax, and I probably have listened to every single one. I think it's really interesting that they are often you listen to it, and then you know, it's like then the bodies were like chopped up and found, and then you leave and you're like, I wonder who died. Like you don't remember even the victim. You don't even remember the killer. It was just a thing that you kind of consumed. I think that obviously there's a place for that because it's the number one. These are the Angry Men, and that are like the number one podcasts in America. But I think that there's maybe we are not making for people the media that they might be interested in, and I've seen them be interested in, which is taking that interest in crime, which is something I'm interested in doing, and that audience, because by the way, it's a very passionate and loyal audience of ladies mostly who, you know, like are also can be effective at shifting change. I think are more open-minded than maybe these shows suggest. And I'm always I listen to a lot of them because I like it, but also because I'm also thinking like, how can I because I would like, you know, I've done a podcast and I think I flipped it a little bit and I think people enjoyed that. And I started thinking about like, how do we use the genre, tap into the audience for the genre, but then instead of like junk food where you go away and you're like, oh, that tasted good, but like I'm a little ill, you go away with something. Like we give you something. You can take these storytelling techniques. I think, and I haven't fully succeeded at this, but I want to, I think that you can get all the nuance, not all the nuance, but a lot of the nuance, in part by being just super honest with your audience. Like, because, you know, being really honest about who these people are that you're reporting on. Like, I want to make my characters like these angels, and they're not, because neither am I. But if I pretend that they're not, if I pretend that they are, and I try to like fit them in, the story isn't as good, you know? I mean, it's just not going to be as good. So I think that there's a way to take that nuance, use that form, or at least this is what I am trying to do, be really honest about who the people are, because I think there's probably no way to get to really, really, really know somebody deeply and without judgment and not have some love for them, unless they're a complete sociopath, but even then maybe. But like, even with all their imperfections, with all of the, you know, usually it's like the person that I'm saying, yeah, my character was innocent of what she has been sent to prison for. But yeah, she did sex work. It wasn't legal. Yeah, she dealt drugs. Sure, she'll tell you that. You know, I can give you the context why, and you can get to know her. And I think that then you can start to question that victim perpetrator binary. You can start to question the police hero and but also like the victim doesn't have to be perfect. You know, the victim doesn't have to be an angel to be a victim, and she can also be a perpetrator at the same time a little bit. You know, I mean, I think my hope is that if you really dive into that and you put yourself through that, which is not fun to go through because you start thinking like, how am I going to even make this work? Then you can come out on the other side and maybe give people a piece of work that is a great story, but is also as true a story as you can hope to get. You'll never get the fully true story ever of anything, I don't think, but as true as you can hope to get. So that's my hope.
If you think that all characters are a little bit relatable and lovable, then you should watch Succession, because there is literally not a single character in that show who is lovable, likable, or relatable. But it's not about crime. Well, it sort of is. I mean, it's about pillaging society, but
Crime.
true.
Really crime. Really crime.
Real.
Okay. Yeah.
But let me start with you for this, Justine, and we'll work our way back down this way. But you know, we're in a law school. There's a lot of lawyers and law students, future lawyers in the audience, as well as journalists. But you know, in some ways, this is a simpler question for the lawyers, because when lawyers are lawyering, our audience is almost always the court. Mm-hmm. Not always, but almost always. We're focused on persuading the judge or the judges, sometimes the jury, occasionally the press, but ethically dubious. As writers, you're dealing with lots of different audiences. And I know that all of you have written many books. You've all written book proposals. You've pitched your book to your publishers. Your publishers always want to know who's going to read this. They don't want to publish it if there's not an audience. When you pitch an editor at The Atlantic who's going to publish your story in 5 years, sorry, Laura.
It's okay.
They killed the one about me that was supposed to come out 3 years ago. It just got killed. So
I know. It's so true.
yeah, at least yours got published eventually. Better late than never. When you're conceiving of a story, a book, an article, whatever it is, a podcast, you have to intentionally engage with who your audience is. The same way that maybe a lawyer will research the judge in front of whom they're appearing before an oral argument. And so I want to just ask all of you to talk a little bit about that process for you, who you see as your audience. Maybe maybe you have data on these are the people who buy my books or download my podcasts. But how and how much does that and should it inform the kind of work that you do? Because look, maybe I made a mistake by inviting really highbrow, literary, intellectual writers here, and we should have some of the quick.
Highbrow.
Well, we could invite. I'm not going to name names because I get sued for libel here. But there's a lot of people in the local press corps we could have invited, who do really trashy crime coverage and really dishonest crime coverage. And I think for those people, it really is all about clicks. And I'm not even saying that as a criticism of them so much as the state of the industry. That's sadly, if you want to keep your job at whichever local TV news, you've got to get clicks, you've got to get downloads, you've got to have people convert those clicks to subscriptions, and you are being measured on that. And so maybe that junk food ends up being your bread and butter, if that's the part of the media ecosystem that you exist in. I think we are fortunate that all of you exist in a part of the media ecosystem that is harder and harder, I think, to find and to inhabit. But talk about what it means to be in that space and how you continue to carve it out and to command an audience that is willing to pay to subscribe to these journals or to download the podcast or whatever it is, in a way that isn't just fulfilling that junk food craving we all have.
I don't know. That's so I would say that now I'm thinking about an audience because I'm writing a book, and in the sense that I'm looking for readers. I'm looking just for people who read books, just, which is mostly, I think, women read books. And my book is going to be about women. So my main goal is I would say I don't think about that so much, in the sense that right now I'm in the writing process. So I'm just trying to write the best standalone thing that I can write. When I made a proposal, there's a book called Three Women, which is about which was a huge bestseller, and I think they made it into a TV series. It was about the intimate lives of three women, basically the sex lives of three women. And somebody did 10 years, this author, Lisa Taddeo, did 10 years of reporting on that. And it was a huge bestseller because I think people just really want to read I think it was just a really good story. It's just immersive. And so I in a way, we were just talking about this, I was kind of this is three very other women, but it's three women, and I want to tell you a story about the criminal legal system. I want to tell you a story about abuse and being a woman in America and violence. But first and foremost, I just want to tell you a really good story, because that to me is the way into everything else. You could have the greatest intentions and the greatest heart and the awesomest case, but if you're not telling a really immersive, because also now there's Instagram, which I can't even have that on my phone. I can't even have the app because I could spend 4 hours watching reels. So you have to find something.
Never join TikTok.
I can't. No, I don't. I know.
I want to know what the reels that come up in your algorithm are, because I'm sure I get a lot of surfing reel. I don't cooking.
If you look at a surfing, once I watched a Zendaya reel, and it was 6 years of Zendaya, who I didn't even know who she was. So you gotta quickly. I don't want to see cats. You gotta quickly go. Yeah. But I don't even allow myself to have it on the phone. I'll only allow it one day as a treat, and then I'll just spend 4 hours just listening to a comedian be well, being a parent is so funny. So that is. But I know that, but when I find a great book, and I do, and it pulls me into it. I'm just so grateful for that the author did that for me, so that I don't have to be on Instagram, so I can actually come away with something. So that is my main focus. But I'll say in terms of like selling articles in this book, at the very beginning of talking about criminalized survival and talking about what was happening, that is now something I've been doing for about 5 years. I've never had less success pitching anything. I've never been rejected more by everyone. For the story about Nikki Adamando, which is probably the story that has been my sort of, I don't want to say this because it's like Nikki's life, but like it has been my journalistically sort of most read story. Probably I got the most, I got some awards for it. I ended up doing a podcast that I got rejected. Nobody understood what I was talking about. Nobody at criminal justice organizations or, publications could understand what I was talking about. They're like, nobody could understand it. Nobody wanted to publish it. And I actually just sat down. I was very depressed. I was 6 months into doing this. I knew I needed to do it. I was broke. And I was like, what if I'm like never, ever can do this? And nobody will ever read it. And all I'll ever do is publish it in like super far leftist magazines that only, a few people read. And then I thought, would I still do it? And I thought, yeah, I will still do it. Like I had to sit down and think, like, I'll never have, be successful in that way. Would I still do it? And I thought, yeah, I'll still do it. And then I just kept on it. But I did sit down. So for me personally, I've been in many different places, but yeah, so sometimes I haven't cared. I just thought this is a story that I need to tell. And sometimes I really want the most people possible to read it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think to echo a bit of what Justine said, I think most people who would buy the kind of book or read the kind of article that I would write, probably more in the book space, are women. I don't think it's a mistake that the vast majority of people who came here tonight are women. I don't think that men read women as widely as women read men. I'll just give you a little example. I was talking to a male friend of mine the other day, and I just thought I'd do an experiment. So I said, what was the last book that you read by a woman? And he got this like weird panicked look in his eyes, and he blurted out, Zadie Smith. And I said, what's the name of the book? And his eyes just like got so big.
Pride and Prejudice.
And I said, you don't know the name of the book, do you? You don't. And he's like, I don't. I was like, okay, so that was a lie. What was actually the last book? And he couldn't come up with one. And I think that that's pretty typical. And so when I'm writing, I tend to imagine that the person who's reading the book is a woman. And you know what? That makes me very happy. In fact, my workspace makes me very happy because I'm surrounded by women. My 3 colleagues are here tonight. They're all women. We joke about this a lot in our legal work that inevitably no one takes us seriously. We're on a text thread where one of us yesterday wrote, when do people stop mistaking you for a law student? And the answer is really never. The first year that I was on the faculty at USF and I took my students to court to meet the judge who was in charge of the misdemeanor department to introduce myself because that's where we were litigating. We went back into chambers and it's, as Chesa can tell you, very crowded with public defenders and prosecutors. They're trying to negotiate their cases. And, of course, I got all dressed up and I came with my students and I when it was our turn, I said, my name is Lara Bazelon and I'm from USF. I just wanted to introduce myself. And he said, oh, what year are you in? And I was like, what? And he said, you in law school? And I was like, no, I'm the professor. I'm the lawyer. And he kind of laughed and was like, well, you should take that as a compliment. And I think that this is constantly happening to the 4 of us. Me less so now that I'm aging out and more likely to be like confused with just a shrill crone. But even still, when we went to see this detective, Charlie and I, in Leon's case, he couldn't get over. He just didn't believe that we were. We said a million times, we're lawyers, we're law professors, we're from the University of San Francisco. He just didn't believe it. And you can listen to the recording, an hour and a half in, he says, like, to our investigator, Eric, a nice, crusty, older white guy, are these 2 young ladies law students? And Eric reminds him, and then at the end, this is the second time, so this is hour 6, trip 2, we're leaving, and he says, I had my son Google you, and he told me that you're a law professor, but I don't believe it. And, and I just think that I'm trying to write for an audience of people who actually believe that I know what I'm talking about and would see that my name is feminine and not drop the book back on the table. Like that I wouldn't have to, be like George Eliot or recast my voice in a way that maybe sounded like something that a dude would feel okay reading. Like I think about that a lot. So I think about that in terms of writing. And then I think the final thing that I'll say is that the other thing that I think about, and this is sort of the standard, is my dad, because my dad has extremely high standards. So this piece that Sarah picked, I was very validated, Sarah, on a number of levels, including that when I asked my dad to read a draft of it, when I was visiting him in Philadelphia, I gave him the computer, I pushed it away, and I came back into the kitchen 10 minutes later, and he was sitting there, and I said, "Are you done?" And he said, "I couldn't get past the first sentence." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "The first sentence says, the case against Gary Washington was a thin gruel." And he just stops and is like, "That's terrible." He's like, "Gruel, first of all, already is thin, so it's redundant. But why don't you just say what actually happened?" And I was like, "That's your comment?" He's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Did you read the rest of it?" And he's like, "No, I think you should just fix that sentence. I just really couldn't get past it." So I think when I think about trying to rise to a high standard and not using hackneyed phrases or, I don't know, cheating and cutting corners or edging toward crime junkie McDonald's type of writing, I think about what my dad would say. And, they did take that sentence out, and lo and behold, here I am.
So first I want to say that experience you had with the cop of him just not believing you were a law professor, I mean, how indicative of it is of his blindness and the way that he conducts himself in terms of cases leading to wrongful convictions. If that isn't telling, I don't know what is. But to answer your question, Chesa, about audience, it's not that, of course I think about audience. I'm in the business of creating work that I want people to read. But when I'm actually in the middle of it, I find that I feel like the audience I'm thinking about is more, what would I want to read? What would I want to listen to? What's missing? What am I looking for that isn't there, and how can I create this thing that can fill that void for me? And if it works for me, then it will work for hopefully lots of other people. And that is kind of borne out, especially with the two nonfiction books that I wrote, The Real Lolita and Scoundrel, but also particularly with the anthologies of what kind of argument can I make? What is not there that I think needs to be said, even in this sort of collected group of pieces, that an anthology that can exist will then reach lots of other people. But I was also thinking about audience from a different vantage point, because before books became my primary source of income, I was a publishing reporter and I covered the book industry. So I felt like I was constantly thinking about audience and marketing and publicity and what kind of readers were gravitating towards which books. So I thought that when it was finally time for me to work on a project of my own, that I would have all of this noise in my head. And much to my surprise and delight, it kind of all just fell away, where all I was concerned with were the questions of the particular project. With The Real Lolita, it was, what is the relationship between art that someone produces and how it builds upon a real life person's trauma and pain, and how that sort of lingers for generations, and how this one kidnapping story will always be linked to this one novel that still causes so much controversy and debate 60 plus years after its publication. And with Scoundrel, it was, how is it that someone could convince people who should have known better, who were in the public intellectual sphere, who had platforms, who had the ability to advocate, to publish books by this guy who was saying that, yes, he's on death row, but no, he definitely didn't kill this 15-year-old girl, even though, spoiler, he did. How did this happen? And what were the forces that kind of contributed to this? Which is why I didn't want to write that book in the way of is it a whodunit? Do we know that he did it? Do we not know? It's like, no, I'm going to dispense with that right away. Like, he totally did it. I'm less interested in him as a person, as a character. I'm much more interested in all of the people that he harmed. And to kind of go to the earlier discussion we had about, complicated people, I've also never really been interested in binary storytelling as a reader, but definitely as a writer, that you write about people, you're automatically writing about nuance, even if you can't necessarily see it right away. That just typical sort of adversarial, good guy, bad guy stuff, that just feels really cardboard and cartoonish and kind of boring. But if you get into the granular details of a person's personality and decisions, be they good ones or poor ones, that just is much more interesting to get into. That happened a lot, in particular with Scoundrel, where I thought I was going in telling the story of the conservative architect and pundit William F. Buckley and his advocacy for this murderer, Edgar Smith. And then it turned out there was this whole other strand of things involving a book editor named Sophie Wilkins, who was at Knopf, who was the editor for Smith's book Brief Against Death, in which he argued for his innocence and convinced many people of it. But Sophie left behind such a voluminous archive of correspondence that really, she was kind of hypergraphic, but as a result, for me as the researcher and the writer, it was just this rich material that probed her inner life in a way that you just wouldn't see normally. But it meant that I felt like I kind of understood her and empathized with her, and frankly, a lot of the underpinnings of her decisions made a lot of sense to me personality-wise. And at first I was like, oh no, is this too much identification? And then I thought, no, I'm going to go with this. Because when people behave in ways that you don't expect them to, and you might feel disappointed with them, or you feel like, oh no, you're making a terrible mistake. But we all make these terrible mistakes. Sometimes they lead to minor poor decisions, and unfortunately, sometimes they lead to spending the rest of your life in prison. And I think that we can't just silo off people as they did a bad thing, they should be punished, or they did a good thing, they should be celebrated, when everything is kind of messy and muddled, and that's actually good.
I have a lot of further questions, but I'm going to ask one very short one, and then we'll save the last half an hour for questions from the audience. I want each of you to give us sort of the two-sentence version, the elevator pitch of what your next project is. You're all unbelievably prolific. You all have probably 4 or 5 next projects. Pick one of them that you're excited about. Start with you, Justine, and I know you mentioned this briefly, but give us a couple sentences on what's next.
I think I did mention it. Basically, yeah, I'm just doing a book on 3 women with my data that I've gathered from, 1,000 women. He said, she said, but he said, and then she said 1,000 times. A book on profiling these 3 remarkable women who are either currently incarcerated for acts of survival, or in one really exciting case here in California of somebody I just met, out and free. And and I'm also going to be doing a podcast on a similar subject. So it's a lot, but it's really exciting. So.
You go next. Sure. Okay. I'm really scared of mine.
So I'm well into the next book, which actually might be some relevance for this audience. It is a case called Oregon versus Rideout, and it was the first time that a woman who was still living with her husband charged him with raping her. And at the time, in late 1978, there were maybe 3 or 4 states, including Oregon, that criminalized spousal rape. The vast majority of states still held by this common law idea that once a woman got married, she was a man's property, and there was no such thing as rape. So this trial became possibly the first national trial involving non-public figures, like not celebrities or the like, that people paid vast amount of attention to, which meant that it was extensively covered by the media. There were so many, I can't even tell you how many terrible hot takes I have and opinions I've read about this case. And even though the husband was acquitted, the resulting fallout, especially because their relationship really followed a lot of intimate partner violence patterns where they reunited briefly, the country turned against her but not him, and they kind of forgot about them as people, but it did lead to the spousal rape laws state by state. So the book is going to talk about the original case, the people, how this became a test case that kind of failed its test, but did lead to systemic change, and also all of the ways in which spousal rape relates to issues of bodily autonomy that we're, I think, as a country having to deal with in ways that we didn't think we were going to deal with. So interestingly enough, it led me to attend my first criminal trial last year. I was back in the same, not the same exact courtroom, but the same building where this original trial took place. And I say that with some wonderment, considering I cover crime, but most of my work, because it's set primarily in the mid-20th century, I didn't have to cover actual trials. I would just read transcripts or talk to the people who were involved, if they were still around. But actually physically being in a courtroom attending a trial was really important, very illuminating, a little bit surreal, just because the judge kept mentioning me, which was also weird, but I'll save that for the actual book. But I'm really, it just opened my eyes to how things actually function in a courtroom that even just reading transcripts or watching coverage just couldn't. So I'm glad to be on this project that I think is, once again, another timeless and timely project that covers the full sweep from the late 70s through last year and kind of catches me up more or less with the present.
So we do a lot of different things in the clinic where I work with my colleagues. We represent people who've been wrongfully convicted. We represent people who've been so-called rightfully convicted but extremely excessively sentenced. We represent people trying to get youthful offender parole. The thing that we do, though, that's the most controversial is that we represent students in colleges who have been accused of committing sexual assault. And we're the only clinic in the entire United States that does that. And it is the most controversial thing that we do. Like, I can go to funders and talk about all of the convicted murderers that we've represented who are unquestionably guilty and have done some terrible, terrible things. And there is no reaction like the reaction that I get when I talk about our Title IX clients. In our Title IX cases, they're almost all cross-racial. Our clients are often first generation. They're black and brown. The situation is the opposite of binary. And like Sarah, I don't really like to live in a binary world, but the issue is told in a binary way. It's a very red-blue issue. It's a very black and white issue. And, you know, to the left, I think my clinic is really on the wrong side, even though we are on the side of procedural fairness and racial justice. And the racism that we see in these cases is unbelievable. And I'm not just talking about what the students do. I'm talking about the administration and the bureaucracy that is tasked with handling it. So I spend a lot of time thinking about this, in part because we get so much flack for it. And I like to move back and forth in my books between writing nonfiction and fiction, and I decided that I really wanted to write about Title IX fictionalized, because I thought that would be the easiest way to do it. And I wanted to do it in the most nuanced, complicated, but also risky way possible, which is our cases. And it's in the book, it's a cross-racial allegation, and it's very unclear what actually happened, but the consequences are fairly outsized. And I thought it would be really interesting to tell it from the perspective of the lawyer who ends up sort of getting embroiled in it and then linking it to her own sexual assault backstory and having those two plot lines that are 20 years apart run parallel throughout the book. So that's what I'm doing, but it's so funny, even describing it to all of you, my heart is beating so fast because all I can think is like, either no one will publish it or someone will, and that will be the end of me, because it's like every third rail to step on, and I feel like a big fat rat in the New York subway about to step on a rail and get electrocuted. And yet, this is the thing that I want to do, and I'm really interested in exploring this issue, and I think that when I've tried to write about it in a nonfiction way, which I have, it's been really interesting, the response, particularly from the left. And I'm wondering what the response will be if it's nonfiction. I mean, excuse me, if it's completely fiction, if it's a novel, if that response will be any more interested in exploring nuance. So that's what I'm doing.
Thank you. We have a lot of reading ahead of us, and I know that only those that are female in the room are going to actually do it, but it's going to be sitting on my bedside table for years to come. Yeah. No, I'm going to have all of your books sitting on my bedside at least until my son graduates from college. He's 2. It'll be a while, but but I'm going to buy the books. You'll get royalties. It'll be good. Everybody will be happy.
That's the actual secret. We want people to buy books. Whether you read them or not is not up to us.
As I said, I have lots more questions, but I want to make space for folks in the audience, and I know there'll be opportunity to chat informally after this at the reception just down the hall. But raise your hand if you have a question. Pam. Can people hear? Let me get you a mic.
Oh, yeah, you have a mic. So.
Thank you, Chessa. So I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I've been thinking about what you've been talking about with respect to nuance in storytelling and coming at it from a litigation perspective, and how one of the frustrations that we often deal with is the ways in which the evidence code and the penal code eliminate the ability to discuss nuance. I mean, we have a hard time even putting in front of a jury in a trial the argument about a rush to judgment by the investigating police and how that affects the likelihood of guilt for our clients. And that's often the prosecutor uses the evidence code to limit us in that. And then, of course, things like the felony murder rule, while it existed in California, affected the ability to tell a story that might have been more nuanced in that way. And I'm trying to find a question here, but I think that what I want to know is whether you've thought about that with respect to maybe the way in which David Simon wrote about these things. I thought, I'm not defending him, but I did think that The Wire did tell a somewhat nuanced story. I mean, Bunk and those police officers are not glorified in the way that they force confessions, and same with the drug dealers and the really violent gang members. And but maybe it does, like, that was what was unique about The Wire, and one of the challenges that you face as writers, that you face as a lawyer, that we all face as lawyers or writers, is trying to get people interested in the gray areas, the nuance, the fact that people aren't all bad or all good.
I mean, I definitely want Justine to answer the sort of what gets left out from the Nikki perspective, just because I feel like in Nikki's case, the jury didn't hear. Like, there were so many things that the jury couldn't consider about what Nikki was going through, and then it was really only after the law changed that, like, a lot of her experience became relevant. But I do want to say, I think The Wire is a work of genius. I still think it's the best television show probably that was ever made. I agree with you. I don't think that Bunk and, as one of the characters likes to call him, McNutty, come across as these angels. Far from it. I think you see the really ugly parts of their police work. I think you see the ugly parts of all the characters, all of them really, and the beautiful parts too. But I also think that if you ask most people, who's your favorite character in The Wire, they would say Omar, or they would say Stringer Bell, or those are the characters that are sort of, they're the most complex and richly drawn. And I guess what I would say about it is that, David Simon wrote those screenplays and conceived of The Wire, I think, probably 15 or 16 years after he wrote his first book, the one that I dissected, right? And so it's easy for me to be a critic of what he wrote in 1989. I think after that, he wrote The Corner, where he was embedded with people who were dealing drugs. He did a lot more reporting. I think he was really a different writer at that point. And that was my pushback with my editor. I kept saying, it's not so simple as to say, David Simon is a bad journalist. I don't actually think that. I think he's a brilliant writer and thinker. And I also think that he saw things in a more nuanced way after he spent some time embedded with the other side. And that by the time it was in the early 2000s and he was sitting down to conceive of this unbelievable show, that he was really quite different in his writing and his thinking. And that's part of my discomfort, honestly, with writing about like sort of his seminal work. But I also thought it was important because it was his seminal work and because people point to that as kind of a nonfiction true crime classic in the same way that they would point to Truman Capote. And I felt like it was important to review it, I guess is what I would say.
Well, since you brought up Capote, I feel like that's a good segue into something I've been thinking about. So I've thought a lot about Truman Capote. You can't not if you're operating in sort of the nonfiction crime space. He wrote In Cold Blood, and there are significant portions, particularly the ending of that book, which he made up. But I actually wrote a piece also for The Atlantic. I had a somewhat different experience, although it did take a while for that piece. Oh, no, it's not. So I wrote a piece about Capote's post In Cold Blood afterlife, where somewhat inexplicably he became something of a go-to criminal justice pundit, where he would appear on William F. Buckley's Firing Line, The Tonight Show, other programs, talking about capital punishment and some of his theories that he thought murder charges should only happen in federal court, not state court. I mean, some of it just, it sounded like it made sense to him, but actually it made no sense at all. But he was also interviewing prisoners on death row for what was supposed to be a true crime documentary for ABC called Death Row USA. It didn't end up airing because of exec changes, and the new one came in and was like, we can't, this is too dark, we can't deal. So it aired, I think, once and never saw the light of day. But he was doing the work, but it was also, the work was working on him. And it just in tandem led to the decline, which happened over time in the 70s and his premature death. And I just thought, what was it about working on In Cold Blood that prompted him to go back to the criminal justice well, but also kind of destroyed his brain? And I think a lot about what this work does to people, but also does to people who are just very fragile in a way that they can't really fully deal with the ramifications of what they're doing. And I think it happened with Capote. With David Simon, I think it was more that in working on homicide, I mean, in the 80s, what kind of questions were we even asking? Exactly. So you have to look, you mentioned context before, that's the context that's really important of, there were barely any discussions of wrongful convictions in that way. That would really come with when DNA evidence became a real thing. And suddenly there was this empirical, well-tested technique that could help free prisoners in a way that a lot of the other forensic science techniques could not. So all of that is to say that, it's important to question narratives, but also put them in the context of the time, but also not let anybody off the hook, even with that context.
George? There's a mic coming, George.
Oh, my. Hello. Thank you, Joni. I'm having a little trouble saying, well, what exactly is the question? But I want to bring it back to Berkeley, city of Berkeley specifically. And I'm working in the police accountability space in this city. Very challenging work for the last 10 years. And some of us are in commissions, city commissions, some are in media, community media, and some in community organizations. I'm thinking about that Leonard Cohen song, Everybody Knows. So there's a few things everybody knows about Berkeley. We have the most excellent police department in the country. We don't racially profile. We don't use excessive force. These are well known. And none of them are true, but everyone still knows them. So, and it really is a very tightly drawn racial divide. And this is not, won't get into numbers, but it's a clear and sharp divide in terms of who you talk to. You get a very, very different experience about police conduct depending on race, particularly black and white. So I think that so two examples. One is there was this bike team scandal that some people may have heard about. It was a texting scandal going on back to 2020-ish, and it was like very anti-homeless texting, racist, involving arrest quotas, which are illegal under state law. So they did an investigation, and they come back and say, well, we can't tell you what the investigation found, but we don't do arrest quotas because that would be illegal. That's kind of the summary of the whole, whatever it was, $50,000 investigation that they outsourced. And when we were doing work on police, they call it fair and impartial policing, racial profiling, well, that's illegal. Yes, no, we don't do that because it's illegal. And yet we know all these things happen. So this is the kind of edge into what you're talking about, is we have to find a way to break that consensus on an issue that the majority of the community doesn't really care about because it doesn't affect them. The black population has gone down from 25% to 7% in Berkeley. That's basically the history of the last 50 years and why things are in the state they are. It was a very different story back in 1970. So I feel like we've won the case in Berkeley on the sort of elite level for a very clear plan for reimagining public safety and restorative justice in general. But in order to really make that case with the population, we have to do some work. We have to do some dug-in community organizing, and we have to figure out how to tell that story. And I believe what you're saying, people, it would be really interesting literature and television and everything to talk about things in those ways. I think it can be done.
George, I'm going to just interrupt for a minute, and I'm going to add a question.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yes.
So here's a question, because this is all really important and something that is in many ways much closer to the way that I think about this panel. And we have writers here, but I'm thinking about a lot of this stuff from the same perspective you are, George. So here's the question I want to add to that background about Berkeley, where we are today. What role, if any, should journalism and writers like yourselves play in driving the kinds of changes that that we want to see, that we know we need to see in our communities?
If there's a driving force that journalists can do, it's not so much that it's accidental, but we don't go in necessarily with an agenda or as advocates, but we do have a perspective, and I certainly don't believe in this, so-called objectivity or view from nowhere. You're a human being. You have a perspective. You bring all that when you report, and hopefully you come out of it not just with some greater sense of moral clarity, but just a sense of putting yourself, sort of submitting to what you're supposed to be working on. I think a lot, not so much about clarity, but moral culpability, that if I'm reporting on a story and talking to people, and especially a crime narrative where I am asking people to give their time to tell me about the worst thing that ever happened to them, that means I have to have such a tremendous sense of responsibility as I approach them, as I expect as little as possible. Like my sort of half joke, because it's mostly true, is that I'm a journalist. That means you should never talk to a journalist. And the reason is that I understand when people get burned, and I understand when they are distrustful of this whole process, because their lives, their stories, their pain, their trauma gets filtered through all of the narrative techniques that journalists employ. And the best ones try to do so honestly and responsibly and empathetically and with care. But many journalists do not, or many people calling themselves journalists do not, or many people who style themselves as journalists do not. And so as a result, it's just the more that we as journalists come in and know what the pitfalls are and try to balance the sense of responsibility with, yes, we want to tell a good story. Yes, we want people to read what we, read or watch or listen to what we produce. And we want people to be, consuming this as ethically as possible, but that in the spectrum of getting what we want, that there's going to be a lot of, there's just going to be a lot of complication, and recognizing those complications is paramount.
Okay. Can't speak to Berkeley specifically, but I would say that when I started sort of doing criminal legal system journalism, I thought I was pretty glum about it, and it seemed like just so impossible for anything to change, et cetera. But with time, even though things have become more complicated and nuanced to my mind, I've actually seen that the interplay between, say, communities, journalists, and lawyers can be really successful. And I've seen it, like, for example, the story Nikki Adamando that I sort of started with, she had a community that rallied behind her. So she got 19 to life, and that was that. She had a community that rallied behind her. She had a good amount of press. She was lucky, for many reasons. She was an appealing character for people to write about, but nonetheless, she had a lawyer that took on her case pro bono in appeals. That attorney was a corporate lawyer from a Manhattan white shoe law firm, Gerard Urbini, great guy. They poured money and resources into it. Her community stood behind it. Organizers had been working for 10 years. Lawyers, judges, feminist activists, incarcerated women, formerly incarcerated women, a lot of people from Bedford Hills had been working for 10 years to get a law finally signed by Cuomo right before he was booted for his actions against women. But he signed this law called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act in New York. Professors came together, attorneys came together to make sure the law was properly implemented. The white shoe law firm did the appeal. He won the appeal. He's like a patent attorney. He's like the head of a patent. He's like the patent guy. He put everything into arguing for this appeal. She had her sentence reduced to 7.5 years, and she is getting out quite soon and going back to her kids. So that's good for her, but that was also a law that then sets precedent. So then that's a huge win for all these domestic violence survivors within the state of New York, who can now go forward with the appellate division having said this about her case. So it's a story of one woman, which is what people care about, because people don't care about hearing about policy, like normal. I mean, I know there's policy nerds amongst us, but your average person just doesn't care about the policy or anything. But if there's a person at the center, I have seen, and Nikki's an example, but I have seen it again and again, and she herself should be credited for not giving up and for keeping telling her story and maintaining her narrative in the face of the state telling her that that was not her story. So so effectively, this group of people with lawyers, community members, herself, have taken the story that was her story that she kept saying was true, that the state said was not true, that was then taken and made false, and she was a murderer, and she was a manipulator, and she was in prison. It was switched around again with the power of people, And, you know, so I think journalism plays a part in that, but that's not in any way the only part. So it's a really big interplay, and I feel like it is a hopeful thing that I've seen again and again. And the one-person narrative is the start, and then the policy change is ultimately the end, or the next start of something else, maybe.
I feel like your hybrid question with Chesa is kind of operating on two levels. I think the level one is, how does the media cover crime, particularly locally, like local media in Berkeley, local media in San Francisco, or when Chesa was DA, really like every media outlet in the entire nation. And that's the sort of quick hit pieces that people write that come out every day. And it's hard for me to, I have a lot of distrust and skepticism for that kind of reporting, because it feels so prefabricated and so sloppy. And you know, you brought up restorative justice. Like, no one ever reports about like a case that successfully went through restorative justice, or someone who was resentenced and is now living a productive life. We never hear about those people. We hear about the one guy who got the plea deal and mowed through a stop sign and killed 2 people. And I don't really understand why it is that the thinking is that the algorithm or that people only click on the story, the last story that I just said, and not the other ones, why it is that there apparently in newsrooms isn't any appetite for these other stories, and whether they've even tested that model. But I definitely feel like, especially when Chesa was in office, every story had one villain, and it was Chesa. If it rained, it was Chesa. If they stubbed their toe, my cat died, Chesa Boudin, every single thing. And it didn't matter that the statistics told a different story. It didn't matter that Chesa doesn't like run the universe or San Francisco. The amount of just like bloodthirst, because how dare we elect someone who had been a public defender, who had these incarcerated parents who had a really different idea of doing things. Like, the media could not take that. And, you know, now we have a new administration, and honestly, like, if anything, crime has gone up, and the coverage is completely different. So I don't know really what to say about that, because I don't want to spend my time doing that. I can't imagine doing that. And I don't really know how to correct that, other than to challenge the assumption behind the algorithm, which is that people don't care about the planes that land safely. They only care about the planes that crash. The second part of it I feel more invested in, which is like, okay, what are the other ways of telling stories? And I think, you know, we're all long form people, because we get to spend time, we get to dig. A podcast is a long form story that I think millions and millions and millions of people will listen to. Believe Her, Justine's podcast, it's funny, like we were talking about, and I confessedly am a crime junkie listener too, which is this like incredibly popular podcast, but I sort of half listen to it while I'm like washing the dishes. I don't really pay attention, because the story is the same every time, just like Law and Order is the same story every time. But with Believe Her, like, I told my kids to leave me alone. I was like, if they talked to me, I would go back 25 seconds so that I could listen to it again. And it really did completely reframe how I thought about this particular issue about criminalized survivors. And so to me, that's a hopeful story. So too is like, there's journalists, you know, I think at the New Yorker, the best thing I've ever read about true crime is this piece by William Finnegan from 1991, where he sat on a jury. It's called Doubt. And it starts with his experience as a juror in this case, and speaking of things that get left on the cutting room floor. Like, it's a really murky case. It's a show up ID. There's a lot of reasons to have doubt. And then you hear about the jury deliberations and the pressure that was exerted on him and this other holdout to fold. And then she folded, and then he caved in and convicted. And afterwards, he can't live with himself. So he becomes like a character in the story, and then goes and reinvestigates it and tries to find all the pieces of evidence that he wasn't shown, so that he can kind of, you know, make up his mind again. And really, like, the end of the story is that he has doubt. I mean, the end of the story is reasonable doubt. They should have, I think, acquitted this guy. But I feel like it's the people who really take the time to do that kind of work. They're not interested in I mean, I love Ashley and Brett. I love you guys, Crime Junkie, I do. But they're not really interested in that kind of narrative, which is in a way prefabricated. I think I could probably write that show myself, because I know what's happening at every point. They're interested in the story that feels like really risky and hard and complicated, and is going to make you see something in a completely different way. And I guess when you're talking about like how to change perceptions around crime and race and poverty and all of the intersections and, you know, communities that are oppressed and harmed, I feel like I have more optimism and faith in those kind of media than I do in the kind of localized coverage that I think maybe you're talking about.
I mean, I think that's also why a lot of my, you know, the media that I gravitate towards is exactly in keeping with what Lara just described. Like, I'm thinking of the work of Connie Walker, who's an Indigenous journalist out of Canada. She did 2 seasons of Missing and Murdered, about missing and murdered Indigenous Indigenous women and girls, and then she moved to New York and did 2 seasons of Stolen on us. And the thing is it's not just about the individual people that she's highlighting, but looking at these deeper issues about how have we done Indigenous people wrong over and over and again, and how did their stories get reframed and put back into public consciousness. There's also what was with American Public Media, but now is a New Yorker property, but the podcast In the Dark, particularly season 2, which led to the Supreme Court actually reversing a conviction, and this man, Curtis Flowers, who had been tried 6 times for a quadruple murder he did not commit, is free. But there are also these larger issues about racism in jury selection, and this one prosecutor who's just like, yeah, it's truly the worst. But even in saying that, it's not just that he's the worst as an individual, but that the whole system is just a complete mess that needed to be just. And Madeline Barron, who's the host, but also her entire team, just the level of care and I mean, they moved to a small town in Mississippi for a year in order to do this work. Most of us can't do that, but the fact that people are around to do that is so necessary and so vital, and I hope we can have more of that.
I would love to spend much more time picking all of your brains. We do have refreshments next door. Please join me in thanking Sarah, Lara, and Justine.